Tilek, welcome to Tibettv weekly analysis. On 1st July, the Chinese Communist Party marked its centenary year. And many scholars believe that the CCP's very existence is a huge threat to the world. And to know more on this subject, I have with me in the studio Mr. Aadil Brar, who was former China media editor at the BBC and currently a columnist at the Print India. Welcome to Tibettv studio, Mr. Aadil.
Thanks for having me. Thank you so much.
Mr. Aadil, I have to begin by asking you about the CCP's centenary year celebration. So what does the Chinese Communist Party's centenary year mean to the rest of the world?
To the world, the party's centenary should be something we should keep in our mind in the context of what is going on around the world, especially with COVID-19 and the kind of behavior that China has demonstrated with the diplomatic behavior, with the global cooperation that they are trying to sort of dismantle with their kind of style that they have currently, the wolf warrior diplomacy. The centenary itself is an interesting event where the party has given itself all these great things, and they have declared that they have completely eradicated poverty, they have achieved the first centenary goal, and all these goals they sound great on paper, but in reality the provinces in China have differences and they don't equally stand up to the kind of vision that the party tries to demonstrate, at least in theory. And on the other hand, I think we should keep an eye on Xi Jinping, who is an important figure within the party. For the first time since Mao, we have such a figure who can call the shots, and none of the other factions or other party members can at all challenge him. And he is a big figure that we saw on the centenary day on 1st July in Tiananmen Square when he went up to the podium and he spoke about the party and the kind of behavior that China hopes to take on, and going forward, China will challenge any foreign forces that might be adversarial towards China. So that is broadly my own reading, and we saw other leaders like Hu Jintao and Wen Jiabao, and they were sitting there, but not exactly as prominent as Xi Jinping himself.
Mr. Aadil, you just raised about China's wolf warrior diplomacy. So can you elaborate how it works in today's time?
The wolf warrior diplomacy is an interesting aspect of China's foreign policy. And recently a book came out by Peter Martin from Bloomberg. He writes about how the Foreign Affairs Department has been part of the army itself, like the way it was set up initially. The diplomats are trained like army people, so they have to go out, they have to make noise, and they have to raise the alarm bells when required. But again, the recent phase that we are noticing is something that started, I would say, between 2012, 2013, especially with the current spokesperson of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Zhao Lijian, who was in Pakistan back then when he started tweeting all these things about Pakistan and countering the narratives of the West. So that this recent phase goes back to particularly his own brand of foreign policy, and the movie which came out with the name Wolf Warrior. I think this whole style has had a very destructive result for China. China has lost friends and continues to lose friends each passing day, and I think China hopes to change the style, but it's already set the standard, so it'll be hard for them to tone down the narrative.
Mr. Aadil, now coming back to the CCP's centenary year celebration, during Xi Jinping's speech, he boldly said, I quote, "We will never allow any foreign force to bully, oppress, or subjugate us. Anyone who would attempt to do so will find themselves on a collision course with a great wall of steel forged by over 1.4 billion Chinese people," unquote. So how should the world read this message? Isn't it outrageous?
It is outrageous, but honestly, I was expecting something along these lines. This is the centenary of the Communist Party, which thrives on sort of hyper-nationalism. So if Xi had not said the things he said, people would have been disappointed in Tiananmen Square. So I was very much hoping and expecting the kind of narrative that Xi Jinping has promoted until now. And the speech for me was not surprising. And sure, the words, if we read them closely, they do sound outrageous to people who don't carefully watch China. But for a China watcher, for somebody who's been watching Xi Jinping in his own style of policy making, I would say I was not exactly surprised. But surely people really love that style of Xi Jinping, especially the PLA and the Communist Party members. They appreciated that style.
Mr. Aadil, you are a columnist at the Print, India. You published a piece titled How Xi's China Did a Nationalist Song and Dance to Mark CCP Centenary and Attract the Youth in the Print, right, on 7th July. So where you are focusing on China's red tourism. I think that is a new concept for someone like me. So tell us about the significance and the importance of this concept called red tourism for the CCP.
Red tourism is a relatively new idea in a sense that they started funding red tourism in 2005. Though a version of it did exist before that period. People would travel to the sites where the Communist Party fought Japan and even the KMT. So these sites where the Chinese Communist Party is seen to associate themselves with, these sites have always been part of this narrative building, storytelling of how Communist Party came to be, how Mao defeated KMT and Japan, and sometimes you'll see the Communist Party is with KMT to defeat Japan, and there's a whole history behind building these narratives. But in the recent time, what we've seen is the party will fund trips to these sites. They'll give tickets, they'll give out goodies to travel to these sites and promote the kind of history that party believes itself should be promoted. And with each leader, we've seen that a new narrative might come on. With Xi Jinping, it's about himself and how he spent time in the provinces when he was sent down during the Mao era, and that again is his attempt to sort of fit himself within the party narrative. And again, I think red tourism is part of the sort of nationalistic framework of China and how the party hopes to inspire the younger generation in China.
So, Aadil, on 1st July, when CCP celebrated its centenary year, as you're aware that Tibetans, Uyghurs, and Hong Kongers, Taiwanese, and Southern Mongolian all over the world protested against it. And they call it a Black Day for all these minorities. So, do you think the China's rise is a deportation of all these minorities?
Absolutely. For the major minorities within China, various nationalities, it's been a very tough time. And looking at China's rise and its sort of economic power, the Tibetans, the Uyghurs, and now even Hong Kongers, which has become a community in itself, are looking at a phase where the Chinese would be willing to do anything to assert themselves on the international stage. And Hong Kongers are the latest minority or a community to suffer under this style of politics and international behavior. And I would say that Uyghurs, on the other hand, of the other side of the Chinese geography and region, we've seen that Uyghurs are equally suffering because of this style where they want to use heavy-handed approach to suppressing any kind of dissent. Even following religion or having Quran in a temple or in a mosque is considered to be against the Chinese Communist Party and against China. And in case of Tibet, we've seen recently there are new restrictions established by the party to control the growth of religion and language, and they're trying to control number of monks who join the monastery. So for the minorities, it is a very tough thing. And I would say the party believes that history is a one-way flow. Though they talk about 5,000-year-old history and they talk about going back to the ancient Chinese civilization, but again, there was a time when Tibet was free. There was a Tibetan civilization. So the Communist Party, I think, is falling into its own trap by believing that history only moves in one direction, and we can see that style of building a narrative. But I would say this has united all the minorities. It's the first time we are seeing a united front against China. The Hong Kongers, the Uyghurs, and the Tibetans are coming together and they're protesting. And I have hopes that this becomes a mechanism to put pressure on China.
Okay, Mr. Aadil, before we wind up, I would like to ask you a very important question regarding China's Winter Olympics in 2022. Since China is going to hold Winter Olympics 2022, it concerns many advocates of human rights, and Tibetans, Uyghurs, Hong Kongers, and Taiwanese and Southern Mongolians all over the world protest against it. So my question is, in your opinion, does China really deserve to hold Winter Olympics, provided their track records in human rights violations?
China does not have the moral authority at the moment to hold the games, especially because of COVID-19 and the way they've handled the pandemic and the way they tried to hide the origins of the COVID virus and the way they did not inform the world about COVID-19 on time. Though there are different theories about the origins of the virus, and we let the scientists decide what exactly happened. But China had enough time between early January in 2020 until the end of February, when the world should have been told what was going on within China and the world could have prepared. And this is something which implicates China's leaders and the whole Chinese administration. So I think morally they have lost the right to hold the games, and I would urge the Olympics Association to cancel the right to hold the games in China.
Okay, with this, we're going to end our discussion here. I would like to thank you so much for joining us in the studio. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Tucci.